Sounds True presents Falling into Grace, Insights on the End of Suffering, a series of talks recorded over 5 days in a studio in Los Gatos, California. And now, Session 1, The Human Dilemma with Adyashanti.
When I began my own spiritual search in my early 20s, it was motivated by two things. The first was an observation that I'd made from a very, very early point in my life. And that was that although life was full of many beautiful moments and happiness and joy and love, that it was also filled with a certain type of suffering and grief and sorrow. And I really thought that if somehow I could break through to a different view of life, to a view that was vaster and larger and more whole, that in my own way, that I may have something to offer humanity that would address this deep and consistent element of human suffering. I remember telling my teacher at a very early point in our relationship that I really, really thought that if somehow I could open up to a greater view of life, that I could really go back to other people with a true and honest heart and say, if I could do it, then anybody could do it. And I really felt that way because I never saw myself as necessarily spiritually talented. In fact, all during my spiritual seeking, it was really a matter of being more and more and more humbled by realizing how little I really knew when I looked at it. And so because I never saw myself as particularly special, that I felt if I could really attain a larger view of life, I could really honestly say to anybody that the same was possible for them. And the second reason that I was motivated in my spiritual life, because I had this desire for truth, whatever that meant. I didn't even have any idea in the beginning what truth was or exactly what I was being pulled towards with this inner yearning to see life with clear eyes, to see the reality underneath what I imagined was a veil of misperception. I was talking with a friend recently, and I was reflecting on my years of teaching. And one of the things I've noticed over the years is that the most important element of any spiritual teaching is the basics, the fundamentals. And strangely enough, these are the exact elements of any teaching that are the easiest to forget because our minds want to move into complexity. And they really believe if we could have a more and more complex understanding of something, that would actually point us to the reality of something. But what I've seen over and over in the years that I've taught, that it's the real fundamentals of a teaching that are most important. It's the most basic elements that really have the most power to help us transform our lives. And that's been one of the great motivations for this series of talks, to present some of the fundamentals and basics of my teaching, because I see them as the most important elements. The more subtle and complex elements of the teaching are really not that important, because the more basic something is, which means simply the more simple it is, the more powerful it is. Again, our minds really deeply believe that something simple can't be truly powerful. But actually what I've seen as a teacher is that by looking at the most basic elements of why we suffer and how we create a perception of life that makes us feel separate and isolated, that these are the most fundamental aspects of a teaching. They're the most helpful and the most useful. And the aspect of anyone's spiritual life that is the most important, even above and beyond any teaching, is the element of grace. And grace is something that really comes to us when we're really truly available, when we become open-hearted, and most importantly, open-minded, where we're willing to entertain the possibility that we may not know what we think we know. In that gap, in that sustaining of any conclusion, a whole other element of life can rush in. And that's what I call grace. It's that moment of aha, those moments of recognition where we realize something that we could really never imagine. And many, many things open us to this grace. Sometimes it's a beautiful moment, a beautiful sunset, when we're just sitting in stillness. Maybe we're going for a walk in the woods or strolling down the sidewalk in a city, and for some reason, a whole new perspective opens up. We've been graced. At other times, grace comes with a more fierce face. It's the way that the most difficult moments in our lives are often the very moments that open our hearts and minds the most. We do everything we can to avoid such moments. But in reality, it's the difficult moments in life that sometimes hold out the biggest opportunities for growth and the transformation of consciousness. So ultimately, these teachings are really ways to open ourselves to grace, to open ourselves to that mysterious element of life that comes in the hidden and quiet moments and shows us a whole new view, a whole new perception of life. And in the end, may show us that we're really not as separated, as isolated as we might imagine. And if we can just begin to realize that we're not separate from the world around us or for each other, this is a revolution in the way we perceive life. And it goes a long, long way towards helping us end the suffering and strife that so many human beings live with day to day, not only individually, but collectively. So each of the teachings in this series of talks are not simply meant to be more information for the mind to collect, but something to be deeply meditated on, to see if you can find the truthfulness of them in your own experience, to really have the willingness to slow down and stop and really digest what you hear. Because ultimately, the truth of any teaching isn't in the words, it's in what it reveals within inside of our own selves. So by having the willingness to really slow down, to digest any teaching that we hear or read, in our own way, we make it our own. And it's by making a teaching our own, by experiencing what it's pointing to within our own experience, that we come to awaken to a view of life that's more whole and real and unified. And in the end, addresses the deepest yearning and the deepest longing of the human heart. When I was a young child, about 7 or 8 years old, one of the things I started to notice and ponder about as I watched the adults and the adult world around me was I noticed that the adult world was prone to suffering, to pain, to conflict. And even though I was growing up in a relatively healthy household with loving parents and 2 sisters and had actually quite a wonderful and happy childhood, what I noticed around me was a lot of suffering. And as I looked at the adult world, I was wondering, how is it that they come into conflict from time to time? And even more than that, I used to be a great listener. I guess we'd call it nowadays an eavesdropper. I would listen to every conversation that went on in that house, In fact, it was sort of a family joke that nothing happened in the house without me knowing about it. Because I was a great listener, I liked to know everything that was going on around me. And so I spent a lot of time in my childhood